Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the British School at Rome. And thank you all very much for being here with us tonight for the 7th instalment in this rich and engaging architecture programme entitled Meeting Architecture Fragments, which has been curated by our wonderful architecture curator, Marina Engel. Over the past year or so, Marina has invited towering figures in the fields of archaeology, history, architecture, and the fine arts to address questions which are as pressing and important today as they have ever been. How ideologies are shaped, memories evoked, emotions stirred by buildings, their contexts, and their ruins, and how to reconstruct personal or collective identity in those zones that are torn by conflict, whether past or present. Tonight is a very special event as we have with us 3 true luminaries. To close, formally, Miroslaw Balka's outstanding exhibition, which we've been privileged to host in the adjacent gallery over the last couple of weeks. Miroslaw Balka is one of Poland's most prominent artists. He turns his hand and his mind to many media: sculpture, drawing, experimental video, and in our case even aspirins and salt, always to outstanding effect. A graduate from the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, he has exhibited internationally for over 25 years, contributing to museums and galleries across the globe. And if I were to list all of these, this introduction would descend into a very, very, very long geography lesson. Miroslaw has become synonymous with the Venice Biennale. He's exhibited there 5 times. And his most recent solo exhibitions include, of course, the Tate Modern and the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Dublin. And many thanks on behalf of British School at Rome for the exhibition and your presence here at this vernissage. Miroslaw will lock horns intellectually, or perhaps dance intellectually, with Professor Joseph Rykwert. Joseph needs little or no introduction as one of the foremost architectural historians and critics of our time. He's the Paul Philippe Cret, Professor Emeritus of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, but there's scarcely a school of architecture that has not benefited from Joseph's teaching, holding visiting appointments at Princeton, the Cooper Union New York, Harvard Graduate School of Design, University of Sydney, the Institut d'Urbanisme Paris, and Central European University, to name but a few. Joseph's work, his publications, including The Idea of a Town, On Adam's House in Paradise, The Dancing Column, and The Seduction of Place, to pick a sample, have made an absolutely fundamental contribution to the development of his discipline, and have opened paths to generations of architectural historians, myself included, who are extremely indebted to him. I don't think I have ever turned in an article that does not make some footnote to his work. Professor Rykwert has rightly been widely decorated, holding several honorary degrees. He's a member of the Academy of St. Luke, Polish Academy, and the Accademia Europea. He's also recipient of the 2014 Royal Gold Medal, one of the world's most prestigious architecture awards, following on, I believe, from Peter Zumthor. In 1984, he was appointed Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and he even impressed Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, provoking her to award him a CDE. Our 2 esteemed guests tonight have more than their dazzling brilliance in common. They both hail from the same town, some 20 kilometres to the southeast of Warsaw, which will be the starting point from which we launch our conversation tonight. And a third gift to you from the British School at Rome is to have Pippo Ciorra from the MAXXI with us tonight to chair the conversation. Pippo, it's always a tremendous honour to have you with us, and it is to your infinitely more capable hands that I passare the parola.
Grazie. Buonasera. I will be very short because I can't wait to invite our guests, your guests, on the stage. Marina is sure I'm going to be a horse running in a Bohemian glasses museum today, but it will be fun. She thinks we're talking about fragments today, which is true because the whole beauty of this program is to invite us to investigate how a time when we produce ruins at an incredible speed, how can we manage to deal with these ruins, what we can do with them, how we can transform them into positive details of our thinking, production, and life. It's about fragments, but in my perception, this talk we're ready to do is to talk about trajectories. I have the impression that starting from the same place, Otwosk, sorry, I'm trying to pronounce, Anya, pardon. But I think from this little country in Poland, I think Miroslaw has been working on fragments, really on fragments, on personal views, on intimacy, on kind of empathic intimacy to the fragments of history to come back to this point. At the same time, Joseph career, which we know very well, which is always followed, since the first book that Squaroni advised me to read was La Casa di Adamo in Paradiso. So, Joseph is applying the same trajectory on a much larger scale, so he's able to have his senses, as he will tell us later, react to entire world, entire geography, entire sections of the history of our world. But from these two trajectories, they come together tonight here to confront their view on the world. There's so many issues raised by the exhibition that Miroslav is closing today here about the role of memory, about the role of architecture, about the role of thinking, about the role of reaction to history and to what history brings us. So I really don't want to steal more time to them. I will invite them on the stage. The format of this discussion will be that the two main guests will deliver a 10 minutes presentation of the work, of how they want to address tonight. And then we will talk more freely about the exhibition, about the topics, about this crossover of scales and reactions, and also it's a crossover between space and time, which I think is very, very interesting. Of course, the whole conversation, since the performance will be in Polish, and there will be subtitle appearing behind our back. Prego. Grazie. So much is. So Joseph, we will start with you. Since everything in this exhibition, every paper, everything seems to start from a few lines you wrote.
Well.
Do you want to speak about it?
Well, it's Miroslav's exhibition, so
yeah.
In a way he should start, but of course you hand me the microphone.
Yeah, I think you will give a ground for the whole thing. Yes.
The construction of place is a process all of us, at some point, have to perform. Because place, of course, is personal, is something which we all need. It's our place in the world. And we make it, we appropriate it through acts of memory. sensory acts, but also acts of memory. So there is no place without memory. And of course, memory implies history. And it's a phrase of the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka, which I have quoted on other occasions, which I find very evocative. Patočka said, history is not a spectacle, it's a responsibility. So I think that's really something that, of course, in Miroslav's work, is absolutely crucial, that sense of responsibility towards the past. And now, of course, we have the problem of dealing with the people who make places in a way, who make the setting of place, which is the role of architects. They're not always conscious of this role, and certainly many of them do not see that they have any responsibility in this matter. That's a crucial word for any kind of sense of how this is made. Architects think of themselves as working for a client and therefore being responsible to the paymaster. But this is not really their true responsibility. Their true responsibility is to the user of the building. And that responsibility and that to the client may sometimes come into conflict. And it's the role of the architect to resolve that conflict. So, architects have not in the past been able to choose their patrons. The great architects of the past have worked for really very unsavory masters. We are in Rome, so we know that some of the great builders of the past were not perhaps the best popes, for instance. But nevertheless, some of the great works were done for these rather unsavory patrons. Nevertheless, I think always the architects who built for these people always had a consciousness rather than consciousness of working for the great public. They were working not so much for the paymasters, but for the users of the building. And this is, I think, the crucial element in the discourse which Miroslav takes up in relation to modernity. The 20th century has been a rather peculiar period from that point of view. And of course, the major architects have worked sometimes for more unsavory masters than the architects of the past. We live in a curious age in which the two greatest massacres in the history of the world were committed in the name of scientific concepts: dialectical materialism and eugenics. Eugenics is often forgotten as an idea, but it was an ideal which was propounded first in England, actually, in the late 19th century, and was developed in relation to racial politics in Germany. And the story of those kind of racial politics and the relationship of German thinkers to it is a long one and complex one. But it is worth remembering that it is eugenics and dialectical materialism which produced those two great massacres. Now, the fact is, of course, that all the buildings of oppression, the buildings of central Berlin, the buildings of central Moscow, and of course, in the end, also the concentration camps, which are the burden of Miroslav's work, were all committed in one sense or another by architects. It's of course an old ethical problem of architects. Do you design prisons? Do you design condemned cells? Do you design scaffolding for executions? Do you design that sort of thing? Do you draw them? What do you think when you're drawing them? How do you respond to the way in which it's being treated? Are you entitled to do it? The concentration camps were built by architects who, I think Miroslaw takes the connection with the Bauhaus, but I think they were actually disciples of the English arts and crafts movement, disciples of Renese's Howard garden cities. So in fact, they are grotesque parodies of garden cities. And I think that is worth remembering. So there is a way in which what we do as architects is responsible to our users, but there's also a way in which we cannot actually control what happens to our work. So with that, I hand over to Miroslaw.
Okay. Perfect. I would have a million things to say, but I think exactly as we said in the beginning, Joseph came to the point by bringing the word to it, and now Miroslav can display it through his work and get slowly and pace by pace to match this discussion. Grazie.
Yes. Thank you, Joseph. It's really beautiful words what you said about the concept of fragment, which we have to deal all the life. You know, it was a very famous Polish poet, Tadeusz Różewicz, and when he wrote very good poetry, which was called Always the Fragment, because actually what we have to deal with all our lives, they are only fragments, and we can be experts of the fragments, but all these fragments, because they are in some way put it together, that even if they are not put it together by us, they feel their presence themselves. Maybe I say a few words more practical about the show, which consists of 3 spaces plus 1 extra space. And this 1 extra space, which I wanted to start with, is this corridor, which leads from space of the atrium to the space of the main gallery. And however, I didn't do anything to this corridor, but in my opinion, it plays an important role in this exhibition, being the space of connections. And also I often work with the corridors, so this as a spaces which are between the main spaces. So I put a lot of attention in my art to the mergence, and one of the mergence of our life is the corridor, the space which goes somewhere, which has not functioned to stay. So the first space, it's some of you may ask why artist who is not architect is taking place in such an event like Meeting Architecture. But I maybe explaining you a few words, I will try to answer for this question. So when you entered to the main space, on the middle of the space is a small concrete sculpture which is carrying 3 peels of aspirin. And this is the work dedicated to the pain and situation, how hard it is to remove the pain, and that the peels are not enough to remove the pain. Once I made the sculpture, which was called Wege zur Behandlung von Schmerzen, which is in the open translation, The Ways of Healing the Pain. And it was made in Wrocław in the European Culture Congress. And it was a big container with black water. And the water was coming at the bottom of this container out of the building and then coming back to the building via the small window at the top. So the water was in the circulation. And the concept of this work was that to heal the pain, you have to stop, you have to watch it, you cannot just throw it away in a simple way out of the doors, because it will come back. But this is actually what nowadays, what we are attacked from the TV sets with all these pills which are pain reliefs, you know, and this is generating the situation that this kind of the medicine will save our lives. What interested me in this sculpture, and coming back to the exhibition, in this concrete with the 3 aspirin pills produced by Bayer, is the historical context of the company like Bayer, which was being the part of the EIG Farben, the second biggest company in the 30s and during the Second World War, still is producing the same pill which people, even during the Second World War, used. So what is important for me in my art are the layers. So sometimes, this information like Bayer is not coming is a first view, it comes later. First you see the sculpture, which is a kind of the simple block, like the block of the concrete fragment of the architecture, which function of this architecture is unknown, but is carrying the traces of the plans. And the second work in the space, there are 4 lithographs, and these lithographs are based on the 4 photos which I took in the crossroad in Auschwitz on the winter day, and later I made intervention, kind of the architectural intervention, and it was based on the gesture of erasing the architecture from the area of this concentration camp in Auschwitz. And what was important as well in the fact that this is a lithography is the fact that printing the lithography, the paper is touching the stone. So the stone is also touched by the paper. So in some way this can be version of the memorial, because there is a shadow of the stone. And then what is interesting that after the use, this stone also will be erased, this image will be erased because another lithography will be taken from the stone. So what is also important, and which has relation with architecture, in this first room, this is a position of these 4 lithographies. They are not placed together on one wall, but they are placed in 4 directions of the world, like these 4 photos which were taken in Auschwitz. So this simple gesture, but for me giving the dynamic to the space and changing the space and giving the dignity to the entrance space. And because maybe I spoke already the time, yes?
Don't worry.
Maybe we can talk about the other works in the show during the conversation.
As you want, as you prefer. We have time.
Yes, because there are 3 important works in
Yeah,
this
so
name,
maybe we
so it will take us...
we can get also there by concepts. So maybe you can speak about them when...
Yeah, but just to say briefly. So
Yeah.
here in the first room we have a kind of the landscape. Then we have the corridor, which leads us to the room of the documents, taken from the real space, but presented as a video works. And then original space at the back, which is a kind of the very private space, very contemporary, very mine, because the space, that each of the spaces has a character, is a dialogue with the position of the witness. And the witness, I am the witness, I am the artist. And so I was in these places, I wanted to share my presence with you here in this exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie. There's so many issues, so many topics that could be discussed. I think the first, I mean, these two guys, as we would say if we were in the American Academy, these two guys, they share a lot. They're both Polish. They were both born in Warsaw, actually. They both have love for architecture with different declinations, and also for Rome, I feel now. In Joseph's case, I know very well. I think you, in different ways, you both address many issues. The first issue I would like you to tell something more about is responsibility. Joseph spoke about responsibility. You are making responsibility come out through your work. But responsibility can be understood in different ways. Now we can think about responsibility, about the cynical consciousness of the architect doing his job in whatever condition, or responsibility is the cynicism of a profession who cannot be different, probably, but they just need to develop this consciousness. So can I ask you, Joseph, to react to this idea of responsibility a little bit more? Grazie.
It's a difficult issue, and of course we are, I think, nearing the end of neo-capitalism. So it is that issue of the responsibility of the artist takes on a particular kind of coloring. In a way, Miroslaw raises it with his pain relief sculpture, which is a kind of monstrance in which instead of a host you have the aspirin pill. Aspirin was synthesized in the 19th century, so it's an old, but it was universally used throughout Europe and America in the 1920s already. And of course, Bayer was one of the main employers of concentration camp inmates. So that pain relief was produced through vast, unmentionable almost pain. And Bayer, of course, were one of the industrial houses which profited from slave labor. So I think it's a rather important notion, to give it that kind of corporal presence. Does that lead on to responsibility? Well, I suppose it does in a way. It was one of the issues which was raised very much during the trials after the fall of Nazism. How much were the industrialists actually responsible for the use of slave labor? Anyone who's read Primo Levi knows that this was very much a presence in the concentration camps, the use of forced labor in industrial production. So this, in a way, is a crucial, to me, is a crucial piece in Miroslav's exhibition.
Okay. Just to switch Miroslav on, I think the idea of responsibility of the artist is embedded in the idea of modernity, no? I mean, it comes with modernity, otherwise we're working for a lord. So, and I think this is exactly what, I mean, this connection is existing in Miroslav's work, so maybe it's a good way to let him join the conversation on this point.
Thank you. Actually, life is also about forgetting.
Okay.
And responsibility is dealing with the subject of forgetting and remembering or not. And actually, telling you about my exhibition, I forgot about one main piece in the first space, in the space of the atrium.
We thought you did on purpose.
No, I didn't actually, but because this work also is about hiding, so actually this work was hidden well. That's so much that I forgot about it. However, this was a very important work for the show, and this work is called AF/modular/1944. And it's a drawing on the wall, on the right wall, which maybe many of you didn't notice, made by pencil directly on the wall. Just simple lines which are related with the figure of modular, designed by Le Corbusier in this time. And among this, maybe I will show you how it looks like. But probably being architects, everybody knows this figure.
Well, yeah.
Just to remember. And I didn't draw the figure, I just draw straight lines which describe this figure and the dimensions and the proportions of modernity, the proportions of the new human being. And actually, at the same time, when Le Corbusier was thinking about these proportions of the man, how to place the man in the most economical way in the space of the public building, at the same time, some of the people, the Jewish people, had to hide. And one of the persons who had to hide was Anna Frank, whose diaries we know. And by the time of being hidden behind the wardrobe in the building in Amsterdam, her parents marked her height, and during 3 years she grew up around 12 centimeters. And actually in 1944, when she was caught, her measure was 162.5. And in this line, describing the figure of modular, I draw the very little line on the height of 162.5, and this is the line which describes the figure of Anna Frank. And I wanted to make these connections to discuss also this physical presence of the body, you know, the body of the little girl and the body of the important architect who was dealing at that time with the subject of human figure. But I think that maybe Joseph could say something more about Le Corbusier from...
When Marina first told me about this work, my reaction was, oh my God, but it will be a problem. But then now Miroslav is giving more details, more a picture and a context for his work, so maybe we can try to react.
There was a countryman of Miroslav's and mine who was just over 2 meters high. He was an architect called Jerzy Soltan.
Yeah.
And Jerzy had been a prisoner of war during the war. But before the war, he had translated some writings of Corbusier into Polish. So when he got out of prisoner of war camp, he went to call on Corbusier in Paris and in fact became his assistant. And in fact, he's the person who drew the modular strip. So he was very much involved in this matter. And he told me that he arrived out of prisoner of war camp in Paris and went straight to Corbusier's flat. Corbusier opened the door to him and said, "Miss Sultan, you're too tall." So that was his vision of the normal. But architects have always been obsessed with the normality of measurement. Anyone who knows about Greek sculpture and architecture knows the figure of Doryphoros, the spear-bearer, who from the 5th century onwards was a standard of measurement for Greek, standard of proportion for Greek architecture. So in a way the modular man is a kind of Doryphoros. But it's involved in another curious episode, which in a way I think Miroslaw sloughs over, because in fact in 1945, when the European community was started, one of the problems was the standardizing of building of industrial elements, and particularly building elements. And the problem was that they were both based on an irrational proportion. 1:2, which is the standard of the German industrial norm, DIN, which became, in fact, the standard of European production. It's the proportion of the A sizes and so on, which is based on 1:2. And the other one was the golden section, which is the standard of the modular. And the European community discussed this matter at some length in the mid-40s. And then, because too much of European industrial production was already using the DIN sizes, they dropped the golden section.
Wow.
But it stayed in America. It stayed as a paper size in America. So, ladies and gentlemen, you all carry golden sections in your pockets in the shape of your credit cards.
Beautiful. That's wonderful.
So the route 1:1 on points, but the golden section is still with us.
Okay. Grazie. This was a wonderful way to react. I think if we want to pass to another dangerous stage of this because in the end this is a reflection on modernity, no? I want to steal something from the beautiful piece wrote by Minio about your show, Remembrance. And something that really hit me in the work of Miroslav is, because every time I was discussing with Marina would tell he's a conceptual artist. Okay, but he's a conceptual artist. But conceptual artists generally tend to abstraction. Where in this case, it seems to you go the other way. You start from the detail, from the fragment, to go against abstraction, to come closer to empathy, to something that has to do with passion. And this is also somehow, if I may say, and Joseph can kick me under the table, it's also part of your theory, no? Is to react again a certain amount of cold abstraction, which is part of modernity and modern architecture. So I think this is another very interesting sharing point. And I think this in art terms is very, very relevant, I think, for your work. So I would love you to say something about this. Grazie. You know, architects love abstraction.
Yeah, but, you know, when around 1989, I slowly, because when I finished my Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, 1985, then I made quite few figurative works related with the figures whose roots are based in the Catholic iconography, because this was for me the iconography which I knew very well, growing up in the Catholic family. So my heroes were the figures of Saint Adalbert, Saint John, Cain, and always the figures which had a difficult history and very often turned to be the victims. So But then, around 1989, I slowly got, I got tired with this figure and the perfection of making figure. So I slowly started to escape from the figure. And this was the way of escaping into the objects which were more abstract, very simple objects like the wooden planks put together in a very simple, straight way, the piles of bricks, and very, very simple gestures, and which could look like the abstract space decision. But what was important for me is still to remember the human sides of this gesture. And that's why I build a theory that, however, the bodies of these works are abstract, the shadows of them are realistic. And what is in this shadow? This is a human side. So the object is not existing without the shadow. So I always put attention to this shadow, and this shadow is never abstract in my way.
That's good. That's very, very good. Joseph, do you want to say speaking of abstraction in a wider way? Does it still make sense?
Well, of course not. After Duchamp, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Okay.
Of course. Once you have the idea of the artist being someone who can nominate any object as a work of art,
Yeah.
then whether it's abstract or not is totally irrelevant.
Okay.
And certainly Duchamp was not an abstract artist.
Yeah.
And Mondrian would have resented qualifications as abstract too. Although we think of him, of course.
But Duchamp made quite a lot of things which are not so abstract, you know, because beside of the main subject of his reflection, which was very abstract, he always was producing, you know, like these little cases which were very gadget things, which were like taken from the 19th century library, or
yes.
you know, packages for the clients, for the collectors who could buy, you know, the set of little gadgets. So being in general very abstract, but in details, even the last work he made, hidden work, yes, it was completely realistic, Tandeno, which was completely realistic sculpture at the end, hidden one, but that's what he worked on last years of his life. But I think it's always in between, you know, we cannot say that after, in my opinion, that after Duchamp things has changed too much, because even the attitude of Duchamp, as I gave example, it was always the balance between this and that. And even seeing the big exhibition of Carl André, which I saw this exhibition in Berlin a few months ago, retrospective exhibition of minimal artist Carl André. And however we could say that this is minimal, this is abstract, but there is always, because of the figure of the artist, it's not so abstract, it's not so...
Yeah, but that's your work, yeah.
I think, of course, to make life easier, we make, in the art theory, the divisions, we make the lines, roads, you know, which let us place different movements. And of course, there is a movement like abstraction, but I think talking about abstraction, we think about something else, yes, about abstraction of thinking. And this is out of the materiality and out of this shelves prepared for the different arts, I think.
Yeah, but in my impression, the architecture took 100 more years to get to the objet trouvé compared to art. It took like 90, 100 years more to architecture to to own that conceptual process that the artists were now architects use words like "has found," no? So has found, com'è, così com'è. So I think there is this kind of time dilatation, come si dice, enlargement, in which things may happen. But if do you want to say something?
No, not particularly,
but then I can ask you a question. No, I saw you wanted to add on this. But anyway, I mean, for us, our education was that you are an architect once you can achieve abstraction, no? Which makes you different from somebody who answers to physical needs. So it's a sophisticated way, I think, to develop, also to help us to develop this concept. But I think, to draw you to another keyword, I think, of your work is this. I mean, in your work, my impression is that you use pain to bring abstraction into something else, something that has a connection with the life of people, no? Which is what abstraction generally does not have. So we use the word, you use already the word pain. So pain is important, no?
Yes. Yes. I mean, to try to, the pain not just to give the pain, but to pain to generate reflection.
Yeah.
You know. So sometimes the material has to be painful and it's necessary to understand something which is hard to discuss without this gesture. And then when you understand, when you see that this was not just a gesture of giving pain for fun, but it was a gesture towards this word which I already mentioned today, towards the healing, the pain. This is what I started, you will not, if you don't understand the pain, there is no way to heal it. So, in this way of understanding the pain, I understand quite important part of my art, especially related with the video pieces, like the ones which are here, for example, 2 of them. And I think that this is the way how I, as an artist, can take a part in the dialogue of understanding and helping first myself to understand and then the others. And this is also how I understand, if we can keep going about the subject of responsibility, as I understand the responsibility of the artist. That this is my care, and my care is also my responsibility.
Okay.
And I find the moments which are not easy, like, for example, video work in the exhibition, which is titled B, and which was made in a very simple way, because most of my video works are made in this simple way. I go to the place, I go to the site, and then I feel being the witness of something, even being the witness of with the relation with the letter B in Auschwitz, the gate to Auschwitz concentration camp, the letter B from the sentence Arbeit macht frei. So when I filmed this letter in the winter day, and it was not my intention, it was the consequences would happen later. It was a group of the young German boys and girls, because it was extremely, the day full of snow falling. So they played snowballs entering, going through this main gate. And I've been just filming the letter B, and they produce very terrifying soundtrack for this video piece. So there's the sound of laughing boys and girls entering to such an important and place which is related with the tragedy of 100,000 people. So sometimes, and I, you know, for example, when I went to Auschwitz, I didn't have this on mind, that this situation like this can happen. But what is important is to, for me as an artist, is to notice this and to decide how to frame it. And that's it.
Yes.
But maybe we can talk about letter B.
You really want to?
No, because...
Yeah, tell them, yeah.
No, the story, because what I also understand as a responsibility of the artist is self-education. And I think that, however I finish academy, I still have to educate myself. So I cannot just give up and say, okay, I have education of history of art, but I think that for me subject of history is very important. So letting myself to say something in the subject of Holocaust, I'm also studying Holocaust. I read a lot of books, I visit the sites, so I make my personal research. And that's why I feel that because of this serious personal research in this subject, I have a right, in my opinion, to share my opinion in this matter.
Yeah.
So the letter B, it was because it was made in a way that the big belly of B was at the top and the smaller was at the bottom. And for many, many years, the Polish workers who made this sentence, this metal sentence for the gate of Auschwitz, they proved that by the fact of making this smaller V at the bottom and bigger at the top, it was the sign of resistance, and that they make a joke from stupid Germans who accepted and exactly and they didn't notice this and that everything was fine. This is a resistance, but I mean, from the beginning I couldn't understand that this could be the truth, knowing the precision of the German, typography and machine, the German machine. So actually I found some blueprints of from the office in Auschwitz, architectural office in Auschwitz, who made different plans for Auschwitz. And I noticed that, because the letters were made by hand, by the person working in the office, architectural office, and I noticed that some of the letters B look exactly like this. So my theory is that this letter written in this way by this person working in this architecture office was given to the workers to make it, and that's why they let them do it, because I can't imagine that if you do such an important change in the main entrance to the camp, and then you can say, okay, so this is my research, and this is my theory.
I mean, we need a very refined historian to react to this.
Well, I don't know if I'm a very refined historian, but certainly my problem with that idea is that, of course, Bauhaus typography and Bauhaus inscriptions were always fanatically and consistently lowercase, minuscule. So a maiuscola is anti-Bauhaus. So I think it's,
Yeah.
that's my problem with that.
I still write minuscule because of that.
You do, yes.
Yeah.
No, if you look at the whole range of Bauhaus typography, and of course Herbert Bayer, who was the king of Bauhaus graphics, was obsessively concerned with this. In fact, when he moved to America, interestingly enough, the only uppercase letter he allowed was I. That may throw another light on the whole affair. But we also have raised so many issues that I don't know where to start. But I think my own sense that art is never abstract really gets in the way of the abstraction of the 20s and 30s. I was taught, like you were taught, that buildings were abstract, that they were abstract entities. And I have always started from the assumption that a building is always a metaphor. So that's what the last 50 years of my research have been about. So in that sense, I'm with him in believing that nothing we do is abstract, nothing we do is without implications, and of course nothing we do is without responsibility.
But our masters told us that maybe abstraction was a device for transmission of knowledge, no?
Yeah.
Okay. And I also have a question for you, because what Miroslav said about pain, I mean, could we talk about, is there a role for pain in the history of architecture? Is maybe the whole program that Marina Engel put up here about the distraction, so a pain brought to the body of architecture and cities. So is maybe the whole program about pain for architecture, no? Can we individuate a role for pain in the history of architecture?
Well, we are in Rome.
Even without Foucault, of course.
And Borromini is, in a way, one of our heroes. And you know about his death. You know he committed suicide by piercing his stomach with a sword and living long enough to repent of having committed suicide, but dying within 24 hours. So pain is inscribed in Roman architecture, if only in that way.
Well, the last, Ridolfi was the last architect, to commit suicide in the moment he could not see anymore enough to draw and design. So pain is with us, and pain is what happens to buildings in this time. No? Pain to buildings means pain to people. There is another word which I find very interesting in the essay you wonderfully suggested me to read. It's this idea of doku poetic. I mean, maybe you don't like it, but I think this idea. I mean, I see today, we have an audience of mixed, artists, architects, art people, architecture people. I think there is a very big hegemony of art in these days, an hegemony which was, at least in the Western world, it was from literature in the 60s or cinema in the 80s, architecture in the 70s. Now art, it seems to be the wider language. The language, I mean, you work with architecture, but you can work with video, you can work with whatever language. And maybe now your work is with art to help us to reread history, to redefine paradigm in history. No? That's very interesting for us. So maybe your work is part of this.
Yeah, so I think that art now is more horizontal, because for many years, the whole 20th century, for example, it was very much vertical. It was only about the position of the artist. Artist is very strong, like the good company producing goods, very vertical, and giving the jobs to the others, and then producing. I think, and I noticed this, fact, and I think it started to happen in the 90s, that this vertical positions started to melt. And artists now are much more horizontal. And being horizontal, they see more, because they don't see from the position of the towers, but they see from the position of the pavement. And they are much more members of the societies now than they were before. So I'm quite happy that I can also participate in this. And for example, one of the parts of my horizontality is my teaching, which I do in the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, where I could share with this idea and with my students, and we can work outside of the academy, which is also an important part of horizontality, to open the doors of the studio, to go on the street, to go to the places which were never dedicated to art. And that's how it is, more or less.
Yeah, that's true. No, but I'm sure Joseph can say, I mean, this is a historiography matter, no? There's not been many new paradigms in history in the last decades. Maybe art is contributing to this. There's a lot of this new, I mean, Miroslaw work could be interpreted also as a new documentary approach, which is a lot of interesting artwork happening around. Do you think art can contribute to redefine and also to go back into history today in a useful way?
Well, I think he is concerned with that idea, which I quoted from Patočka, that we have a responsibility to history. That history is not something we look at, it's something in which we are involved and which colors us, and which we, in interpreting, we are inevitably involved in personally.
Okay. But do you think there is a privileged condition today for art to do this? I mean, compared to other scholarly.
Well, certainly the thinking about such matters is done by artists, not by architects.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that it's not only about artists. I think it's about all of us.
Yeah.
Our way of thinking has changed. If we look at Europe 5 years ago, we didn't expect things which came now, and this means that we all have to look at the things in a different way. We have to deal with this new subject, with the things which we already forgot, and it's above the function, a professional function which we are carrying. You know, things like empathy, for example.
Yeah.
This is out of the professional discourse. You know, it's more about us human beings. However, it sounds very pathetic, but this is a time for us human beings to show that we are human beings.
I agree. Well, I think I have to say that also in the architect's life today, there's much more horizontality. I mean, somehow chosen, sometimes forced, but we are very much into the things more than it was before. I wanted to spare some time for the audience, to questions, but I have some last, and then I can go on forever, but I mean, I have at least one last question is, I mean, it's interesting because your work is very much a very clear historical, in this exhibition, a very clear historical issue. But then the word that really took my stomach is this video you shot in your house. And now this idea that how horror can be transmitted like in a synecdoche, you know? I mean, it's a metonymia in Italian. Now, just by documenting its own fragments, you know, and how your presence, the light, the way you enter into the life of fragments is a way of expressing your empathy to a much wider. So, I mean, this is a comment, but if you want to comment on the comment,
You said so.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I shouldn't have.
So I don't know what else I can tell, but yeah, for me also in the relation to this exhibition, because for example, there are not new works in this exhibition. These are the works which already existed and the drawing which I did for the second drawing on the wall. But the new value which I am happy, which I could generate in this exhibition was this: for the first time I add my very personal room, which was the last room, to these more historical spaces where I was more hidden behind my work. And in the last room, especially two last works, because first, first it was important gesture which you notice, that you enter to the last room and the three monitors which are in the space, they are turned back. So when you enter, and then you don't see the images in the first moment. You have to walk in. And actually, walking is a very important part of my work, but this is for another discussion, because presence of the body in the exhibition is another issue, but very important for me. But the first video was very personal, watching of one of the first architectural form, which is the smoke, because I think that the shape of the smoke is also very much about architecture. And the bonfire, for example, when the people constructed the pieces of wood in a special way so it can easily burn, and it was very much related with the architecture as well. And the architecture which you burn, so you do something and then you destroy something. So this emptiness and the shadow of the smoke was important in this room. But then there are two personal videos. One is when I brought my camera to my old studio in Altfels, and I make kind of like the detective visit in the night with the light of the night shot of the camera. So I try to follow each corner of the studio and to show the details. And then you always saw the fragment. Yeah. So I think this was relation with this main title of this cycle, of this exhibition, Fragment. And the last video the last video was the video when I tried to hit the moon with the head. And this was about the relation, the romantic relation between the romantic landscape with the full moon and the artist who tries to get the very personal relation with this art.
Well, I think that taking away, in that last section, taking away the monumentality of the subject, let your expression come out, becomes extremely clear. I have a question for you, but if you want to add something on that, no?
No.
So the younger generation of architects and artists, they're trying to stress and stretch architecture as much as possible to take it again closer to political life, no? And today we see a very intimate way of dealing with the global history of political life. So do you think there is a chance do you see any possibility of architecture? We see that Miroslav's work is somehow terrible to us because he accuses what we consider, or not accuses, but it emphasizes what we consider the archetype of progressive modernism, socialist, populist, like Bauhaus as full of shades and contradiction. So can we ask architecture to be more political today, or it's just wasting our time?
I think architecture is inevitably political.
Okay.
And I think at the moment, the tallest building in the world, again, is halfway up. It's 1 kilometer high, and it's going up outside Jeddah, Kingdom Tower. The previous tallest building in the world was the Burj Dubai Tower, which was a mere 800 meters. Now these buildings are very interesting urbanistically because, of course, you can't enter them on foot. So they're surrounded by pathways and so on. So they reject any involvement in the public life. Architects who do that sort of thing have a responsibility.
Yeah.
And in a way, such a profession as ours should be able to blame them, expel them from the profession. But we don't do it. On the contrary, we give them medals, and they earn vast sums of money. And these buildings are there, and you can go to the top, and you can't see anything of any interest from them.
Yeah, of course.
Stretches of sea, stretches of sand. But what responsibility do these people have to architects in general and to the society for which they build? It's a big question, and it's with us, and it will be with us for some time.
Forever, yeah, I think so. Thank you. We still have 10 minutes, so I would open up. I see beautiful minds in the audience. I would love them to take part. Vado avanti io adesso. Franz. Prego. Joseph, would you like some water?
Joseph, you said something earlier on about the fact that artists do the thinking now. Architects don't do as much thinking as architects now. As artists, sorry. Architects don't do as much thinking as artists.
Well, it goes in phases, doesn't it? Yes, it goes in phases.
Can you say why that would be?
No, I think this is the kind of changeover in the situation for which it's very difficult to give any explanation. I don't know why artists are so intelligent nowadays, but we should be thankful that they are.
I just make some consideration and not a question that architecture had to do almost always with the concept and the notion of space, and art more with the notion of place and figures. And the problem we have now, it seems to me, very much the fact that until the mechanism or the machinery are exactly visible, we are not so much in a danger. We start to be in a danger when mechanism and machinery are not visible. And we are facing a problem with absence of control of the machinery are in fact guiding the world. And and so between place and between figures and measurement and space can be some sort more solidarity in the future to your opinion, for example, as for the concept of come si dice, paesaggio, landscape. For
I
example,
think that's a question
the
of
concept
much
of
for
landscape.
Miroslav as for me.
Well, yes, I think Miroslav, as an artist, has done a longer step towards architecture than we architects did towards art. So maybe Miroslav can answer if there can be a closer collaboration between the two techniques. I mean, the two
Yes,
approaches.
of course.
Yes, give him the question, and then you can answer.
Or maybe you say.
No, Miroslav and then Joseph.
But you mean between two groups, artists and architects, precisely? Or?
No.
No, I think that this is a time when the projects are mixed by people of different projects, professions, you know, and nowadays, really, actually, there is a fashion word which is called project, which I'm not very crazy about this word. However, because we didn't find another word, that project very often means collaboration of different people, musicians, artists, architects. But I think what is the sign of today, that I think that each group started to observe each other much closer than it was before. So now things are, as I said before, we are not so separated, you know. Now I know more architects than I knew, for example, 20 years ago. And I think that this is really the time how we can, not forgetting about our skills, because this doesn't mean horizontal, doesn't mean that we are just liberated from any skills and everybody can do everything. Of course not, but it's about the collaboration between each other, and I think there is a space for this collaboration between architects and artists as well.
Do you want to say something? You want to,
Well,
you can get a question from Francesco.
Yes, I have a question for Miroslav Balka. And you mentioned many times, and actually your work showed very well this notion of pain, which is, I was interested by the fact that you, in fact, never mentioned a word that is quite similar, but at the same time is quite opposite, which is dominating the practice, the theory, and the art history, which is violence. So I was wondering whether you, first of all, this silence on violence is something intentional or polemical, or is something that you haven't taken into consideration?
Well, of course, that's partly why Miroslav's work is so important, because it really insists on the presence of violence in society. But on the whole, we try to avoid that idea. Well, not even avoid it, but keep silent about it. But occasionally it breaks out. In '68, there was, as you know, a famous outbreak of violence which went all over Europe and did a certain amount of damage to tertiary education in the world. But violence does break out, and of course one of the interesting things is that as wars become more localized, so violence in general society increases. Maybe violence is something nasty that we need. I don't know.
Miro.
Yeah, I would like to finish with this what Joseph said.
Okay. So thank you. Grazie. Good, no? Very good.